from my family background, I know definitely more from my father's side, but that family is from basically Hungarian speaking, so very like Austro-Hungarian empire, and that side is Jewish, and my mother's side is not Jewish, so my mother converted, and her family is more kind of like, I mean, in Austria and Vienna already, for like her mother already grew up in Vienna. Her father's family also grew up in Vienna. So it's been like more rooted in Vienna, but kind of like originally from like Bohemia. So it's also kind of Austro-Hungarian Empire. A lot of people in Vienna are from Bohemia. And my dad's family, so my grandmother grew up, she was born in Vienna, but she grew up in Mattersburg, which is east of Vienna. It's like it's called Burgenland, the area, and it's very close to the Hungarian border. So this was kind of a borderland of Austro-Hungary, and there are a lot of different minorities living there. And there were 7 historic Jewish communities there. So she was living in one of those in Mattersburg. That's where she grew up. That's where her father was from and living, even though he studied in Budapest. So there was a lot of exchange. And her mother, so my great-grandmother's family, was from Uzhgorod, which is western Ukraine. Ungvar, as it was called, also German and Hungarian speaking. So my great-grandmother then married and moved to Mattersburg, like to what then became Austria. And my grandfather's family was from Budapest. He grew up in Budapest. And then basically after, so was also in hiding in Budapest, then came to Australia and were displaced, like as a displaced person, and was living there. Got Australian citizenship, had a burger restaurant also, or like a small burger chain, but then came back to Vienna because his father was killed in the Holocaust. His mother was widowed and remarried, but was very lonely, and he came back to be with her. And my grandmother's family, if I should also, go into that. So they were living in Mattersburg. That's where my grandmother grew up at a time when there was still a Jewish community there, but she's still alive today. She was a young, like a baby and then like a toddler during the war. And they fled, so her parents and her fled to Ungvar, where her mother was from, and they stayed there for a couple of years when it was still safe as refugees. But then when the Nazis came there, basically they were the first ones to leave and go into hiding because they were refugees, which is ultimately what saved their life, because everyone else was sent to Auschwitz, basically, from the whole town. But they were already in hiding, and so they were they went into hiding, like in a baker's family, and then were in hiding there until it got dangerous. And then for the last part, they were in Budapest with false papers. So just like my grandfather, and there was also a lot of, like it is in every survival story, it's a lot of luck that happens. But what I find so interesting is they came back, 45, basically, came back to Burgenland, to the area where they had lived before and where there was a vibrant, or maybe not vibrant, but there was a Jewish community, and they were the only Jewish family, basically, that returned. In 45, they had a textile shop there, even though the father was a doctor, but he wasn't practicing anymore. Yeah, and that's kind of how, I don't know, I identify a lot with that, with these aspects of the story, because kind of like, growing up Jewish in Vienna, I think it's related a lot to this question of like coming back and relatively soon after. Yeah.
Do you have stories in the family from before the war, like in terms of what life was like? Do you have a picture of what life was like?
Oh, I mean, I have a picture, literal picture hanging in my parents' apartment now of my great-grandmother in Budapest. And she was 21 years old and was painted, and it's a beautiful portrait. Yeah, it's just kind of this glamorous, I mean, it's really like this glamorous kind of bourgeois life, very assimilated, of like I have a bit of an image of like Jewish Budapest before the war, what it was like. And especially my grandfather's family, I know he was like very assimilated, and very, very much rooted in the city, like the urban elite in a way. Yeah, very educated. And I have some pictures also. I mean, my grandmother, I did a kind of like an oral history interview with my grandmother. She showed me all the pictures, and she also loves showing me the pictures of Užhorod, of Ungvar, before the war, which was also very interesting. I mean, that also was, the way it sounds, like very, there was a lot of like high life there, or like very well educated, and people dressed up on Sundays to go for the walk. And she showed me the pictures of all the kids being dressed up to walk on the river on Sundays. Yeah, so it's interesting, but it's also, I mean, it's definitely it's definitely a more kind of like bourgeois history. It's also interesting for me because I've been dealing so much with kind of like also Yiddish working class history, and that's definitely not my family background. Yeah.
And how much did you grow up with stories of, you know, your family's past when you were growing up in Vienna?
I grew up with quite a bit of that. I mean, for sure, also a lot, I mean, very early on, kind of Holocaust memory, and just on this very personal level. I don't know, I think that's kind of common that people with like a history of, they learn very, very early about it. So I definitely learned very early also about my grandparents' survival story. I also heard from my non-Jewish grandparents, like their memories as children during the war, and you know, stories of hunger and these kind of things. I also heard a lot of stories kind of, because it's a bit, my origin story is a bit related to my grandmother's, because my parents were set up by them, and my grandmothers met when they were 17 years old, because they got a scholarship to spend a year in the U.S. With AFS, American Field Service, and so they met on the boat to the U.S. So I don't know, they were both. It's kind of. They're also both. They're both still alive. They're both very, very different people, but very ambitious, smart women, and yeah, I think that kind of already started when they were 17 and got this scholarship, and that's basically how my parents met. So it's, I don't know, it's kind of, there's also like an origin story that I grew up with a lot in that sense. Yeah, so it's also not just dark history. It's also, I also grew up with some, kind of like nice mythical stories of this period, specifically the post-war period. And
what was it like, first of all, where in Vienna did you grow up?
I grew up in the 6th district, very close to what is called the Naschmarkt. It's like a nice historic market. It's it's relatively central. It's not it's not a historically Jewish district or anything. It's like a historically more like working class, but it's kind of, as it is often with like historically working class districts, it's kind of was the forefront of gentrification. Like I guess kind of my parents were one of those for the the yuppies moving into that district. They still live there, and I still spend a lot of time there with them. Yeah, I mean, I loved it growing up in Vienna. It was definitely a really nice and free growing up. I went to a school that was very close by. It was a Protestant school, Protestant elementary school. That it was easier to get in if you have like any kind of religion. Like as a Jewish kid, it was easier to get in than if you don't have. If you're not religiously affiliated at all. But so already from the beginning, I always grew up with a very strong sense of kind of being a minority and not necessarily like, never really as a child, never any antagonism, but always kind of like a minority, something different. I think specifically growing up kind of in the Protestant school and yeah, I don't know. The deal was kind of that I pray along for the morning prayer, but I don't fold my hands because it's the same God. I don't know. There was some logic to like how I should participate. Yeah. And then also from like very early on, I think I was 5 when I started. I started going to the Socialist Zionist youth movement, Hashomer HaTzair, which was basically, I have to say, like it was kind of the only option. Like in terms of youth movements in Vienna, Jewish youth movements, there's Bnei Akiva and there's Hashomer HaTzair, and there's Yad B'Yad, which is more like for the Bukharan community. So it's basically either you're religious or secular, then you go either to Bnei Akiva or Hashomer HaTzair if you're Ashkenazi. And that was kind of also necessary because I think the reasoning was, my parents didn't want to send me to the Jewish school. That is, in Vienna, it's very like, some Jewish schools are very open, but the school in Vienna is not. It's also only really open to kind of halachically Jewish Jews, according to Orthodox halacha. So it's very enclosed, and they didn't want that. So, and I'm happy I didn't go there. But then to have some kind of connection also to Jewish life in Vienna and other friends. I went to Hashomer HaTzair, which also my dad went to, and had a lot of friends from. So it made a lot of sense. And so I started there very, very early already. So I had this kind of double life. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in terms of your family, what would you say were, what was important? What were the values in your family, in your home growing up?
Generally, what were the general values? I think there was a lot of emphasis on education and on reading and on kind of cosmopolitanism also. So I grew up kind of bilingual. I mean, my parents spoke English with me when I was born, which, they're both not native speakers, but they both spent extensive time in the U.S. So my mother grew up a lot. She grew up in all kinds of different places. She was born in Vienna, but then she lived because her parents were diplomats, and she lived in Cairo and then in New York. And then she kind of finished high school in New York and came back to Vienna, and then also still did a master's in New York through Fulbright. And my dad went to college in the U.S. He went to Princeton, and so they both have a lot of connections to the U.S. I think that's why they brought me up speaking English. When I was 7, we lived for a year. We lived in New Orleans, and that was very fun. I think that was also like part of this, I don't know, I guess kind of cosmopolitanism. Maybe it's also like, I always joke, I say I come from like a family of Americanophiles. Like it's very, I think in every generation, people have some kind of connection. Like there's a lot of connection, I think, to the U.S., even though, my uncle moved to New York. He's an U.S. citizen, but otherwise no one is. But so I grew up a lot with that, English children's books, and yeah, a lot of knowledge. A lot of my parents are both journalists, So I definitely also grew up with a lot of politics everywhere, politics all the time. Yeah, I think like I remember asking my dad at some point. I think I was like maybe 5 years old, and I was like, "Oh, what are you thinking about?" And then he was like, "Well, I'm thinking about I think maybe it was the U.S. elections or something like that, like Bush." And he started telling me about the different politicians, and I would always ask like, "Oh, is he good or evil?" And then like yeah, so I grew up with a lot of that as well. And then I grew up with a lot of, with a strong sense of belonging, a strong sense of Jewishness, but in a very, in a kind of reduced way. Like there was never a lot, but it was always clear it's important. There was never any, it was very secular, but it was always clear like it's, certain things we do because we're Jewish, and I don't know, Friday nights, like very reduced prayers and actually no singing really. But we did it. Most Friday nights we lit candles and I don't know, had some pseudo challah. Not really. Like it was always kind of adapted to, I think, my parents both working full time and having a lot of other interests as well. And I think one of the things was also that I grew up with in the Reform synagogue. So, or like it's kind of liberal synagogue. So it's between American Reform and Conservative, I would say. And that's the synagogue that my grandparents helped found also. Was founded in the 1990s. And so I was both a member of the main Jewish community and of that liberal synagogue. So I grew up a lot with that when they got a new space and so on and so forth. Yeah.
What's the name of the
Or Hadash, yeah.
And so did you have like a favorite yontif growing up?
That's a good question. I mean, growing up probably was Purim, I think, yeah.
Do you remember
Definitely.
how it was celebrated?
I remember actually having a Purim party at Or Hadash before there was now there's like a fixed space for the synagogue, but that was before. That was like a rented community center, and I remember dressing up for that and the Gragers, and yeah, that was a lot of fun. Also in Hashomer we had good Purim parties. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, later it became Pesach, but I think more for like political reasons. I think before that, as a kid, it was definitely Purim. Yeah.
So growing up with, the connections, several connections to different Jewish communities, I'm curious how you felt, like what your own sense of Jewishness and your own sense of Jewish identity growing up in Vienna.
I felt it always very strongly, and I think I felt it also so strongly kind of as this, belonging to a minority, but also I always felt it was something special and something very meaningful. I mean, as a kid, the way that kids are sometimes believe or something like that, like there were different layers of, I had some phases where I was also like praying, I don't know, it was like I wanted to say the Shema every time to go to sleep. So it's just like something as a kid I made up, or like sing it basically. That's what I wanted to do. As a child, I was also already very much loving kind of singing and kind of Jewish music. Although I have to say now that when I think about what Jewish music I had access to, it's not necessarily the music that I'm doing today. It was like a CD of Israeli folk songs, so like these classics like Jerusalem of Gold, or I don't know, the Hatikva was on there, like stuff like that. But I listened to that CD up and down, and I could sing all of the songs like with gibberish Hebrew, and I didn't know any of the titles. And I remember that at Protestant elementary school, I was singing these songs at some point to my classmates. And the next day when I came in, they had like organized a concert for me. Like I didn't know about that, but they made like flags with my name on it, and they were like, we want you to sing for us. And then I was like, okay, I'll do number 7 and then number 4. So I was like, I didn't know the names of the tracks, but I had like a little concert of Israeli folk songs. Some of the prayers at Ochadash, at the shul, that were sung, that are very much kind of it's a mix between the some of the like German Reform melodies, like Sulzer, Lewandowski, but just like one line of the choral arrangement, and then sung like in a participatory manner, or this kind of more U.S. Reform, like Debbie Friedman type of melodies. I think that's kind of like, now I know more about what it was that I grew up with sonically. I did also go to the Stadttempel, to the big like main Orthodox synagogue. As a kid, more than later. I think we definitely shifted more to Ochadash, but I have like less memories from that. Just more like running around as a kid. It wasn't gender segregated yet, so I could run around on all parts. So I have some memories from that. And there was a lot of that went to like kind of a Sunday school type thing also, which was kind of boring, not very well done, I think. And then it was mostly Hashomer that I really grew up more with the sense of like Jewishness, secular Jewishness. I mean, it was interesting because my family really wasn't Zionist in like a sense of, I don't know, we never really went to Israel a lot. Like we went once as a family on like a holiday, but it was more kind of like the same way we would go to Italy to look at like it was never really ideological. But in Hashomer, I definitely got the more like nationalist, singing Hatikva every week, and I don't know, having all the flags everywhere, and learning a lot of history that I later found out was not so correct in the way that I learned it. But it was also a lot of other things that I connected a lot to Jewishness. Like, for example, it was, because it's a socialist movement, which, I mean, it's not very socialist anymore, but some parts still remain. Like, for example, the idea was always that you always share, and you get like you buy a lot of sweets and then we share them. Basically, that was the idea. But I mean, I grew up with this idea that my Jewishness was connected to kind of being left-wing. And I think that's something that came back then through the Yiddish music, definitely. Like in my mind, this was, Jewishness was connected to also all these kind of humanistic and socialist type values,
I'm curious, did you have any musical lineage in your family background?
Not at all. I'm really the first musical person in a long time. Yeah, I always joke that I got the voice of my mother and the ear or musicality of my father. Like, my father has a really good musical understanding and hearing, but really not a voice. And my mother has a nice voice, but not necessarily kind of, musical understanding. But I have really nothing. I come from a family of like, everyone has very, more like, a lot of intellectual work, but not necessarily artistic. Actually, no, just my great uncle, no, my great uncle even, he was a painter. That's like the only, I think, artistic part even.
So if I had asked you when you were 12 or so about Yiddish, what might have been, what is Yiddish or what your associations with Yiddish were, can you put yourself back there and think you might have answered?
When I was 12, I wouldn't have known what Yiddish is. I don't think so. Maybe I would have... I think I learned it a bit later, maybe, only through one of my friends growing up from Hashomer. I spent a lot of time at her house, and her grandparents spoke Yiddish. That I remember. They were from Poland. And I remember actually maybe then that was a bit early. Yeah, maybe I would have associated with that, because we did go for lunch sometimes at the grandmother's place, and she didn't speak Yiddish with us, but she definitely had a bit of a Yiddish accent, yeah. And there was like a certain thing also that people would say, I mean, that's kind of a derogatory thing to say in like German. I know now that it's kind of like comes from a bit of a derogatory German Jewish thing, but you would say people are Yiddeling, Yiddeln. So it's like speaking German with a Yiddish inflected. It's a bit like this whole discourse on Mauscheln that kind of sticks in a way. I mean, so there were definitely some people who, but I never actually heard someone speaking Yiddish at all. Yeah, let me think. Maybe some other grandparents, or maybe that I knew that they speak it, but I really didn't have any association, and also not with the music, except for this is a good thing to realize. At Or Chadash, we sang one Yiddish song. I don't know when it was introduced. I don't remember it as a kid, but maybe as a teenager, probably when I was doing bat mitzvah, and I had to lead. I had committed myself to like do the children's take care of kids during Friday night services. So I was at a lot of Friday night services, only the beginning part, and I'm pretty sure we sang. We sang like Shabbos, Soll sein Shabbos. That we sung that in Yiddish. So that's probably the first Yiddish song that I learned, that I sang. I always really loved that. Yeah.
And I'm just curious, when you obviously mentioned you talked about this in your family, but I'm curious how the war was discussed or taught in the broader society and in school. Mm-hmm.
It's definitely something that I grew up with already knowing from home a lot, and had, I think, through that a very also emotional connection. It affected me a lot emotionally. So by the time, I think I grew up kind of in a unique period in Austrian, like Viennese. I mean, I'm kind of part of the first generation of people in my family, at least, where the Holocaust and kind of acknowledgement of participation in the Holocaust. This only happened in Austria in '89. So I was basically the first generation to grow up with this in school, which means we talked about it a lot. I mean, there's basically in Austrian school, like middle and high school, you do basically 2 full years of history only related to the Holocaust and World War II. And I'm pretty sure I don't think it started in elementary school, but, there I just remembered that every time there was in religion class any mention of like Jewish culture, everyone turns to me. And then later when there was kind of Holocaust, I was also the only Jewish kid in my class. And basically my school, maybe I think there were 2 other Jewish people in my like entire middle and high school. So, and it was covered really a lot. And I think one of the ways that I managed to, I think one of the things that was a bit tiring was kind of this, having had this very emotional, personal connection to it, and not really, I don't know, I remember just as a teenager that I was always a bit uncomfortable because I felt like it affected me differently. It was not as distant as it was for other students. But then on the other hand, there was also kind of a bit of like overcompensation from the teachers or from the other students, that I also didn't want that everyone always turns to me when it's about the Holocaust. Like I'm not the speaker for. So this was a bit tiring. I remember also going, visiting Mauthausen as a teenager with school classes. That was terrible. I think there was a period when we thought that that my great-grandfather had been in Mauthausen or had died in Mauthausen, which we later found out that it was in Buchenwald. But I just remember as a younger teenager, but going there and I don't know, it just affected me very differently. And then there were some school kids who were like in the gas chambers, like kind of with ear pods in the head, and like it was just terrible in that sense. I was really upset about that. I think one of the great thing was that my grandmother used to, I mean, she still does it sometimes, but not a lot, but she used to give talks in schools about her survival stories. And she came to my school once. Then I was already like 16, 17. I was definitely older. But that was very meaningful, I think, for me also. I mean, she gave it to other classes in my school as well, but that was really meaningful because it was personal. And I think once I also brought my grandfather. So my grandfather died when I was like 14, but we had his Shoah Foundation video cassette, and I brought that to school. I also remember that really well because I almost thought that I had lost it, and my father was like freaking out. It was like screaming at me for like it felt like hours. We found it in the end, and it's also like now I guess they're all digitized. But it was like a different, there was a lot in that situation of having thought that I lost the cassette of my grandfather's testimony. And what was also interesting was that we had a school trip so I visited Poland and the camps with Hashomer, with a delegation from Hashomer at around, like, I think also when I was like 15, 16. And that was very meaningful. Also very, like, I reflect on it differently now, that there was also a lot of, I think, kind of age inappropriate or like a bit like brainwashing in some directions, even though it was definitely not as nationalist as like March of the Living or something like that. But I don't know, I just didn't think it was, thinking back about it, kind of these questions of like, oh, what would you do in the Judenrat and stuff. I don't think that's like very appropriate. Or I don't know, watching the Escape from Sobibor on the bus. It was just too much, like thinking back at it. But it was meaningful. And then I went a second time with my high school, which was kind of like an organized trip that happens every year. It still happens, March of Remembrance and Hope. And I was there. We spent one day in Krakow. I was there, and the next day we were going to go to Buchenwald, and I had like, I suddenly got a really high fever. I had like almost 40 degrees Celsius, or like maybe 30. I don't know, it was 39. It was high enough. Like it was a high fever out of no reason, and so I stayed home. It was obviously kind of psychosomatic, and I think I was very happy. Like I was very fine with not having gone with the school class. Yeah, it's just in these situations I felt it really strongly, kind of, and now reflecting back on it, it's also just, I think it may also just totally make sense from a perspective of like, I don't know, trauma and being triggered, and these are basically the situations, and then you kind of. It's very important who is around you and how people relate to you. And even if everyone was super understanding, it's just not the same thing if you don't feel like you're part of a community of people who have a similar story. Yeah.
Well, I want to go a little bit towards music, but before we go to that, is there anything else you want to add about, your growing up in Vienna? What that was like for people who are not, who didn't live there.
Yeah. I mean, maybe also just that, it was very fun, and it was also, I think it was a very good time to grow up being Jewish. Like it's really not, people often assume that I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism, but I really didn't. And I think it's very different also from like my dad's generation and his brothers. He also always is like, maybe I'm just lucky, but I never really experienced anti-Semitism growing up or living in Vienna. But but he was also, it was a different time. There was not really, any public acknowledgement of kind of participation in the Holocaust or in the Nazi regime. And there was a lot of, kind of like the more like anti-imperialist protests, anti-Israel protests, where there were some, at least situations that made, young left-wing people, or I don't know if my father was left-wing, but like people in Hashemia, they were uncomfortable with a lot of situations. I mean, there was definitely definitely more anti-Semitism in different, and I think just kind of baseline in society. I think when I grew up, there was very little, but that doesn't mean that the anti-Semitism doesn't exist anymore in Austria. It does, and I think a lot of the things that I grew up with was more kind of a philo-Semitism that I think is equally problematic in some ways because it still kind of keeps you as other, and like to a certain extent, I think it's important that like minorities stay also like organized and can keep their own like cultural distinctiveness, but it's like not good if there's a kind of othering coming from the majority society that is also very much it's neither good if it's antagonistic nor fetishizing. And I think part of the reason why it's a problem is because it can flip again. I mean, there's a certain dialectic in this kind of philo-Semitism, apart from the fact that it can also be dehumanizing or weirdly in this fetishization. But that being said, I mean, I would still say it was a great time to grow up in Vienna, and I think I got a lot of I grew up with a lot of valuing also of Jewish culture, and I think I still experience that as a musician working primarily in Vienna and with Jewish culture. I think there's that there is actually a big appreciation. I mean, aside from the more problematic aspects of philo-Semitism, there is a lot of appreciation and genuine interest, which I think is very nice.
So what was your sort of, from the time that you had your first concert in school, organized by your friends, what was your musical training from there to starting to do this professionally?
So at some point I think when I was 7, I started learning flute. That's the instrument that I chose. I wanted to do, I had classical music lessons. I played flute only until I was about 12 or 13, then I quit. Then I wasn't playing in the, I think, crucial years that you need to really become a good instrumentalist. Then I started again at age 17 for 2 years, then I quit again. So it was always a bit on and off with that. But and I already started singing quite early. I mean, I don't remember, I don't think I joined a choir when I was a child, but I did do some, or did I do a musical? Maybe I only started in middle school, really. Then I started singing in a choir, in the school choir. And then I also, I think at age 15 or something, I started also I took some jazz singing lessons together with a friend. And then a bit later, I was also again singing in a choir as a teenager, and then kind of high school when I was graduating, I was again in choirs. I had a short phase of classical singing lessons also. So I just kind of got a lot of different stuff. But even the times that I didn't have training, I was singing a lot. I was always singing a lot. I was singing, actually, at some point, my favorite thing to sing were Christmas songs. There was a lot of Christmas song sing-alongs, and also we celebrate Christmas with my grandparents on my mom's side with a lot of singing. Because my grandfather remarried, and his wife, my step-grandmother, she's a good singer. She has a nice voice, and her family. So there was more singing there. And my mom at some point was like, "Stop singing Christmas songs!" And it was like, I don't know, it was not even Christmas time, and she was just very annoyed. So and the singing in shul. So that was kind of like outside the training, but the training was, I mean, kind of, I got formal music education with playing flute and with some choir singing, basically. Yeah.
So we'll come back to music, but I think I'm curious to talk about your year, on the kibbutz and what you were exposed to and what happened in that time. So, first of all, can you just explain sort of where you were and why in that year?
So that was a gap year, basically right after high school graduation. And it was a gap year organized by Hashomer HaTzair, by the World Movement. They have this program, Shnat Hachshara, so an educational year program. And it was not, at the time, there were not so many people from Hashomer HaTzair Vienna that were going on Shnat, but just above my group, there were 2 people who went, and they really loved it. And, there was a lot of trying to encourage people to go. So, and I, at that time, I was taking Hashomer really seriously. Like, especially, I mean, how it works in Vienna in the movement is that from 16 to 18, you kind of take over and you become a group leader, a madricha, and I took that very seriously. I really loved doing that and organizing educational programming, and I don't know, I had a great time with that. I was also feeling very connected to my peers in the group, and then 2 of my friends had already decided that they would go, and I had actually decided not to go, and I wanted to go abroad to study, to go to college, kind of. As a teenager, always my dream was the U.S. and like liberal arts college in the U.S. Like my dad went, but then I ended up finding my grandmother pointed me towards this program in Amsterdam, which is also like a liberal arts college. They have these liberal arts colleges in the Netherlands, and they're way cheaper and closer. And I don't know, Amsterdam, I thought would be nice. So I had already applied and gotten in. And then basically last moment, I deferred to still do the gap year in Israel. And I came there, very naive, kind of driven by this dream of socialist Zionism. And then came to this kibbutz. I mean, of all kibbutzim, it's interesting that Hashomer chooses, they start the program in a kibbutz in the south, very, very close to Sderot, to Gaza. It's like 2 kilometers away from the border to Gaza. And there's nothing really there. And it's also a privatized kibbutz. I mean, I think it's part of the reasoning is they have kind of they're trying to support it financially, and they're trying to support kibbutzim that are not, doing so well. But it's not even, communal anymore. And I was there, and it was just kind of shattering my visions a bit of what kibbutzim are and what I'm going to, how my life will be on the kibbutz. It was also interesting for me. I think one of the formative experiences in that time was already in that beginning time, because I was homesick. And I think it was a bit this experience of, I had grown up all the time with this idea that Israel was my homeland, not from home, but from, the whole, everything we learned in the movement. And I was just kind of like, oh, but this is not really what and I don't know, I felt like a bit, it just shouldn't sound derogatory, but, we were kind of in the desert, like we were very close to the Negev. I was just like, I'm just in the desert, and I miss my, high, city life, like bourgeois city life. But also, I think I also just realized that I was feeling very disconnected from my I realized at the moment how much my Jewishness was rooted in Vienna. It was like a Vienna Jewishness. And it was also an age when I was reading a lot of Vienna Jewish modernist literature. That was what I had kind of graduated in, on like Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday. Like, it was this kind of this was my sense. I was going a lot to coffee houses. Like I was living kind of as if I was in Vienna 1900. And it was very disconnected from like this more rural kibbutz life. Even in the south, like not even where there are a lot of other kibbutzim, for example, in Israel. And then there were also some, this was 2012, so there was a war, kind of an escalation with the Gaza Strip, with Hamas. And because we were so close, we basically started having bomb alarms every day. It was also like basically our rooms were already, like my room, I was sleeping in the bunker. So every time there was an alarm, people would come in and shut the door. And the disco was a bunker. And it was also a very strange experience then, because we were like maybe 70 young people from all around the world in that kibbutz, all from HaShomer. It was it was also South America and North America. And parents were freaking out. I think my parents were the only parents that didn't really send an email. I don't know. They're more relaxed about these things. My mother was a video journalist, so she went through a lot of area. I don't know. They were more relaxed. They were like, as long as the Israelis will know when to take you away. But all the other parents were freaking out. But we were there relatively calm. I mean, the people living on the kibbutz were relatively calm. They experienced it a lot. And we were also just kind of like, well, we don't really have such a sense of danger because there's the Iron Dome and we have the bunkers. And it just wasn't, it wasn't this sense of terror. I mean, it's still, it's affecting, have the alarms every day. But that was interesting. Also, like conversations with people, and I remember we were all like, "Well, I guess we feel not really in danger, but we are kind of." It was like a lot of thinking about it, the situation, and then kind of, being so close to the Gaza Strip. I think that was already very much thinking a lot about that situation, the situation on the other side of the border, basically, and we. Then we were evacuated to a kibbutz in the north, which was more like a communal kibbutz. I forgot the name of it. Something with a base. But it was very nice. I worked at the kindergarten there. That was fun. I figured out that I don't like working with kids then, but it was definitely fun. And then we spent, so then also after the war was over, we spent 5 months in Haifa, living in a commune type of thing there and doing social work and doing an ulpan in the morning and the social work in the afternoon. And I did the ulpan every day with it was a lot of post-Soviet, Russian-speaking immigrants. And in the afternoons, I volunteered actually at a Christian Palestinian hospital for severely disabled kids. I kind of fell into that, and it was actually very